I bought my parents a $380,000 lakefront cottage for their anniversary. When I arrived, my sister-in-law had changed the locks and left my parents outside with their suitcases. She snapped, "Get off the porch. This house was never meant for people like you." Then I stepped onto the porch, and her smile died. Aunt Lorna called at 11:14 on a Friday morning in October. She did not say much. Lorna is not a woman who says more than the situation requires, and what she said was this: "Your mother is sitting on a porch that isn't open. She's been there since 9. I was driving. I had been on the road for an hour and 40 minutes. I had another hour and 20 ahead of me. "Is she inside?" I said. "No," Lorna said. I asked one more question. Then I stopped asking and drove faster. On the passenger seat beside me, wrapped in a cloth so it would not scratch, was a brass key on a simple ring. I had picked it up from the engraver 6 days earlier. On the back of the key, in small clean letters, it said, "W&J 40 years. I did not look at it. I kept my eyes on the road. Welcome back to this channel. My name is Maeve Caldwell. I am 38 years old, and I am a senior partner at a landscape architecture firm. I design outdoor spaces for a living. I read properties the way some people read faces: the sightlines, the drainage, what the soil is doing, where the light falls at different hours. When I bought the lakefront cottage 8 weeks earlier, I had walked the grounds for an hour before I walked inside. I knew that property better than anyone who had been standing in its doorway that Friday morning. I noticed the new lock set before I noticed anything else when I pulled into the drive. This is the story of what happened on that porch, what was in the folder on my back seat, and why my sister-in-law's smile was already gone before I said a single word. My father, Walter Caldwell, spent 31 years as a pipe fitter. He retired at 63 with 2 bad knees, a pension that covered the necessities, and a small house in a neighborhood where everyone knew each other's cars. My mother, June, worked the cafeteria line at Garfield Elementary for 22 years. She knew every child's name and every child's food allergy, and she never once forgot either. They married young, stayed married, and built the kind of life that does not look impressive from the outside, but holds together because the people inside it decided it would. I grew up in that house. I knew what the pipes sounded like in winter, and which floorboard creaked in the hallway, and how my mother folded towels in a specific way that nobody else in the family ever managed to replicate. I knew my father's coffee mug, the one with the cracked handle he refused to throw away because it held heat correctly and fit his hand. I knew what our kitchen table looked like at 6 in the morning, when my father read the paper before work, and what it looked like at 11 at night, when my mother checked the doors and turned out the light. I knew the particular smell of that house in October, which was coffee, and something my mother used on the woodwork, and the cold coming in through the window above the kitchen sink that had never quite sealed properly. I knew these things the way you know the things that made you, not consciously, just bone deep, the way you know the weight of your own hands. What I did not know until I was much older was that the things I had grown up with were considered by some people to be markers of limitation rather than evidence of a life well built. I learned this slowly, the way you learn most things that wound you, through accumulation rather than a single event. A comment at a dinner, a pause before a sentence, a face that said more than the words it was arranged around. Petra had a very expressive face. I also knew what my brother Conrad had been doing for the past 7 years. He had married Petra Whitley, who came from a different kind of family entirely. Her parents owned property. Her father had a membership somewhere. Her mother had an opinion about everything and delivered it in the tone of someone who had never seriously considered that her opinion might be wrong. Conrad had always wanted to be taken seriously, which was not something our neighborhood had been particularly good at providing. Petra's family provided it. The weddings they attended were in different venues than the ones we grew up going to. The conversations were about different things. Conrad started dropping certain references and picking up certain others, the way people do when they are learning a new language and want to be understood. I watched it happen over the years and said nothing, because who was I to tell my brother which version of himself to prefer? The cost was that he had stopped explaining us. Not to Petra exactly. More around her. He referred to our parents as the folks at her family events, and did not bring up my father's work in contexts where it might require explanation. He had not visited the family home in 3 years. He said he was busy, which was partly true, and mostly not the point. Petra did not think of herself as cruel. That was part of the problem. She believed the world had natural categories, and that certain things belonged in certain categories, and that mixing them up created a kind of disorder she found genuinely distressing. My parents were not in her category. She had never said so directly. She had found other ways to make it clear. The clearest was a Christmas dinner 3 years ago, when my father said, in the easy way he said most things, that he had always wanted a place near water. Not a big place. Something with a porch and a view. Something where he could have his coffee in the morning and hear the lake. Petra set her fork down and looked at him with an expression that was almost kind. "Some things are just not in everyone's budget, Walter," she said. "That's not a judgment. It's just how life works." My father nodded. He said he supposed that was true. He picked up his fork and moved on, because that was what Walter Caldwell did with things that landed wrong. He absorbed them and moved forward. I sat across the table and did not say anything. I had learned, over the 7 years of Conrad's marriage to Petra, that the things I wanted to say to her were not worth the aftermath. Conrad would say I was being sensitive. Petra would say she had not meant it that way. My mother would squeeze my hand under the table and change the subject, which was June's version of keeping the peace, which she had been keeping since before I could remember. I filed the moment. I kept it. 3 years later, on a Tuesday in August, I drove to a lakefront property that a colleague had mentioned in passing, and I bought it in 32 days. I want to be precise about what I mean when I say I drove to that property. I mean that I went alone, on a weekday, and I walked the whole site before I walked inside. I stood at the end of the stone path where it met the water, and I looked back at the porch, and I thought about my father saying he had always wanted a place near water. Not a big place. Something with a porch and a view. Something where he could have his coffee in the morning and hear the lake. I thought about Petra saying some things were not in everyone's budget. I stood there for about 10 minutes. Then I went back to my car and called my attorney. 32 days is a fast closing. I asked Gideon to move quickly. He did. I was not going to let the property go to someone else while I was thinking about it, and I had already finished thinking. The cottage was not large. 1,100 square feet, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that looked out over the water, and a porch that ran the full width of the front face and faced the lake directly. The grounds were 3/4 of an acre, and when I walked them that first afternoon, I already knew what I was going to do with them. The soil near the water was soft and dark. The light came in from the northwest in the late afternoon and turned everything gold. There was a stone path from the porch to the water that someone had laid years ago, slightly uneven, and I thought about my mother's hip and made a note to have it re-leveled before October. I paid for it myself. I did not discuss it with Conrad. I did not mention it to Petra. I told my parents nothing, because the plan was to drive them there on the morning of their anniversary and hand them the key on the porch, and you cannot do that if you have told them. I called Gideon Marsh, the attorney who had handled my last property transaction, and I told him what I was doing. He asked 2 questions. The first was whether I wanted to transfer title to my parents, which would make it their property outright. I said no. My father's pension covered necessities, and my mother's savings were careful and small, and property taxes and maintenance on a lakefront cottage required a financial cushion that they should not have to maintain. I wanted them to have the use of it without the weight of it. The second question was how I wanted to structure the arrangement. Gideon took 2 days to think about it and then came back with a lifetime use agreement. The cottage would remain titled in my name. My parents would have the legal right to use it for the rest of their lives, rent-free, at any time and for any duration they chose. No one could remove that right, limit it, or condition it without my explicit consent in a signed document. He filed copies with the county recorder's office, with his own archive, and sent originals to me and to my parents. He walked me through it on the phone the afternoon he sent it over. I asked him what happened if someone decided to challenge the arrangement. He said the same thing he said about most legal documents he had spent time on, that it could technically be challenged by anyone with a filing fee and a bad idea, and that anyone who tried would be looking at a very clean deed and a very clear agreement and a very unhappy outcome. The cottage was mine on paper, he said, but my parents' right to be there was protected in writing. That way, no one could confuse love with ownership. It was his phrase. I thought it was the most useful thing anyone had said to me in years. And I thought it again, 4 weeks later, when I watched Petra standing in the doorway of a property whose deed she had never checked. I had the grounds re-leveled. I planted a row of winterberry along the western fence line because my mother liked red in October. I had the stone path reflagged and set level. I installed a lockbox on the service door with a code I set myself, and I gave the property manager in the next town my contact number for emergencies. Then I had the brass key made, the one with the engraving. I picked it up 6 days before the anniversary, wrapped it in a cloth, and put it on the passenger seat of my car. I told Aunt Lorna about the surprise 2 weeks out, because Lorna was driving my parents and I needed her to keep the secret. She said she could do that. She also said, without being asked, that she would be there when I handed them the key. She did not explain why. She did not need to. What I did not know, and what I would not know until I was already on the road, was what Petra had been doing that week. She had called an emergency lock service from 2 towns over on Thursday morning. She told them she was handling access for a family property with a lost key issue. She gave them the address. She did not give them the owner's name because she did not know the owner's name was mine. She paid with her own card. She signed their service form. The receipt, which she was given as the customer, had the date, the time, the address, and her name in print. I have thought about this more than it probably deserves. The call took some nerve, in the particular way that things take nerve when you believe you have the right to do them. Petra was not a person who second-guessed her entitlements. She had grown up in a family where things were owned and managed and decided upon, and the management and decision-making was always done by people who looked and sounded like her. What she was doing on Thursday morning, calling that lock service and describing the cottage as a family property with an access issue, felt to her the way administrative tasks feel to people who believe they are the administrators. Routine. Necessary. Her job. What Petra believed was that Conrad had described the cottage to her as a family property, because that was the word Conrad used. He had told her Maeve bought a place near the lake as a gift for the family. In Petra's interpretation, a gift for the family was property that belonged to the family, which in her understanding included herself and Conrad above all other members. She had decided, sometime between when Conrad told her and when she placed that call, that the cottage needed to be handled differently going forward. She would manage access. She would decide who came and when. She would be the one standing in the doorway. What Petra had not done, at any point, was check the county property records. The deed was public. My name was in it. A person with a filing number and 5 minutes at a county records terminal could have known it in October when I bought the cottage, or in any of the 8 weeks between then and the anniversary weekend. She had not checked. It had not occurred to her to check, because she had decided what the situation was, and people who have decided what the situation is do not usually go looking for documents that might complicate their decision. That was her blind spot, and it was the size of a deed. She had been standing in the doorway when my parents arrived at 9 o'clock Friday morning. My father had driven from their house at 6:30, the way he drove everywhere, leaving more time than necessary because that was the kind of man he was. Lorna had met them there. They had parked and walked toward the porch, and found the door locked, and Petra standing on the other side of it with her arms crossed, and an expression that June would later describe to me as the one she saves for when she's already decided. Petra told them the house was unavailable that weekend. She told them Conrad was reviewing how the cottage would be managed going forward. She said they should have called ahead. My mother said they were expected. My father said they had come a long way. Petra told them she understood that, and she was sorry for the inconvenience, and they should put their bags back in the car. She did not invite them in. She did not offer them a glass of water. My mother, June, who has a bad hip and who had been in the car for 2 hours, sat down on the porch step with her hands in her lap. The porch chairs had been moved inside. My father stood beside her with both suitcases and looked at the lake. They waited more than 3 hours. That was when Lorna called me. I stopped once on the drive at a gas station 20 minutes from the cottage. I did not need fuel. I pulled into the lot and sat with the engine running. The brass key was on the passenger seat, still in the cloth. I looked at it for a moment. I had been imagining a specific scene for 6 weeks. The driveway, the morning light, my parents walking up the stone path that I had re-leveled for my mother's hip, the key going into the lock for the first time, my father's face. That scene was no longer available. I was going to have to build a different one. The folder was in the back seat. The code on the lockbox was still mine. The deed was what it had always been. I sat there for 4 minutes. Then I got back on the road. I had a folder on my back seat. It had been there since Tuesday, when I printed everything and put it in order. The deed, with my name in the owner field, and the address of the cottage and the county seal on the bottom right corner, the title certificate. The lifetime use agreement, signed and notarized, with my parents' names in the beneficiary section and Gideon's office stamp on the last page. The property insurance certificate, with my name. The property tax statement from August, with my name. I had brought the folder because Gideon had told me once, in a different context, that if you own something and someone disputes it, the cleanest thing you can do is have the paperwork in your hand before the argument starts. I had not known, when I packed the folder on Tuesday, that I was going to need it on Friday. I am a landscape architect. I work with documents and site plans and surveys and boundary agreements every day of my working life. I understand what a recorded document means. I understand what a county seal means. I understand that the name in the owner field of a deed is not a suggestion. I thought about my mother sitting on the porch step without a chair. I thought about what a bad hip feels like after 2 hours in a car and 3 hours on an uncushioned step. I thought about my father standing with both suitcases, looking at the lake he had said he always wanted to see from a porch, seeing it now under circumstances that were the opposite of the ones I had planned. I thought about Petra in the doorway with her arms crossed, and about the 3 hours, and about the Christmas dinner 3 years ago, and about the word budget, and about how my father had nodded and moved on the way he always moved on from things that landed wrong. He was not going to have to move on from this one. I put the car in gear and drove the rest of the way. The neighbor's name was Mr. Howell. He was 58, a retired surveyor, and he lived in the cottage on the east side of the property line. I had met him once, briefly, when I was walking the grounds in September. He had introduced himself over the fence and told me he watched the properties in winter when most owners were away. When I pulled into the drive and stepped out of the car, he was standing at the fence line with his hands in his pockets. He had the look of someone who had been waiting for the right person to arrive and had decided to wait as long as it took. He told me a lock service truck had come on Thursday afternoon and been there for just over an hour. He told me he had not recognized the company name, which was how he knew it was not the local outfit. He told me the locks on the front door and the side door had both been replaced. He said he had written down the name on the truck and the time of arrival because he was a surveyor, and that was what he did with information he thought might matter. He asked me if I was the owner. I told him I was. He nodded once and went back to his porch. I walked toward mine. My mother looked up first. She saw me and her face did something I did not want to look at too directly. My father picked up both suitcases without being asked, the way he always moved when he had been carrying something and saw someone arrive who could help carry it with him. Lorna was standing by her car at the edge of the drive. She looked at me once and then looked at the front door. I walked up the porch steps. As I passed my mother, I pressed the wrapped brass key into her palm. She looked down at it once, saw the engraving, and closed her fingers around it without asking what it meant. I set the folder under my arm. I looked at the lock set on the front door, which was new and silver, and had not been there when I last visited the property. Then I looked at Petra. She had come out onto the porch when she heard the car. She was standing with her arms crossed, and she had an expression that I recognized. It was the expression she had worn at Christmas dinner 3 years ago, when she told my father that some things were not in everyone's budget. It was the expression of someone who has assessed the situation and found themselves in control of it. She said the cottage was not available this weekend. She said Conrad had decided the property needed to be managed differently. She said she was happy to work out a schedule, and I should contact her through Conrad's email. She said all of this in the measured voice of someone who had rehearsed it and was now delivering it with the confidence of a person who expects the other party to accept what has been said and leave. I did not speak. I was looking at the lock set. It was silver. It was new. It was sitting in the hole where the original hardware had been, and the door it was protecting had my father's fingerprints on the frame from where he had tried the handle that morning. And as for your parents, Petra said. She turned to look at my mother and my father. Get off the porch, she said. Then she looked at the suitcases. She looked at my mother's hand on the railing. She used the tone that people use when they want to appear magnanimous about a thing they have already decided. This house was never meant for people like you. My mother's fingers closed around the brass key I had given her when I walked up the steps. She had been holding it since I pressed it into her hand. The key no longer fit the lock. She held it anyway. My father looked down at the suitcase handles in his hands. He had been carrying those suitcases on and off since 9 o'clock that morning. He had driven 2 hours and waited more than 3 and said very little, because that was how Walter Caldwell handled things he could not yet see the shape of. He trusted that a shape would appear. Aunt Lorna stopped walking and went still by the car. No one spoke. The lake was behind me. The wind came off it and moved through the winterberry along the fence, and the red berries caught the light and held it. Then I stepped forward onto the porch. Petra's smile was already failing before I spoke. It was the particular failure of a smile that happens when a person's expression has been running on assumption, and the assumption is no longer available. She did not know what I was holding. She did not know what was in the folder. But she saw my face. And something in my face told her that the room she thought she controlled had different dimensions than she understood. I opened the folder and took out the deed. I said the address out loud. I read the county and the state. I read the date of purchase. I read the name in the owner field. It was mine. I said it plainly. I said that the cottage had been purchased by me, in my name, as a gift for my parents to use for the rest of their lives. I said their right to be on this property was in writing, drafted by an attorney, notarized and filed. I said I had never put Conrad's name on the deed. I said I had never put Petra's name on the deed. I bought it for them to use, I said. I did not give it to Conrad. I did not give it to you. And I never took my name off the deed. Petra said Conrad had told her it was family property. She said she had understood it to be shared. She said her voice was still controlled, but it had changed register, the way voices do when the ground has shifted and the person standing on it has not yet decided whether to admit it. Conrad was right that it was a family gift, I said. He just had the wrong idea about which family members it involved. I took out my phone and called Gideon Marsh. He answered on the second ring. I put him on speaker and held the phone between us. I said I had a question for the record and asked him to confirm the title status of the property at the address I read aloud. Gideon said clearly and without hesitation that the property was titled solely to Maeve Caldwell. He said no other party held legal interest in the property. He said the lifetime use agreement protected Walter and June Caldwell's right to occupy the property in perpetuity, and that this right had not been modified, waived, or transferred in any way. He asked if there was anything else I needed confirmed. I said no. I thanked him. I ended the call. Petra turned to Conrad. Conrad had come out onto the porch sometime in the last few minutes. I was not sure exactly when. He was standing at the edge of it, near the door, and he was holding the deed that I had passed to him when I took the phone out. He read it the way you read a document when you are looking for your name and cannot find it. He read it twice. He said it on the porch railing without speaking. Conrad, Petra said, say something. Conrad looked at my parents. He looked at me. Then he looked at the lake. He did not say anything. You were right about one thing, Petra, I said. I kept my voice even because there was no reason to raise it. The deed was on the railing. Gideon's voice was still in the air. Some things are not in everyone's budget. This one was in mine. Petra said something after that. I do not remember exactly what it was, because I had already turned to the lockbox on the service door. The code was the one I had set when I installed it 8 weeks ago. I pressed it in, took out the emergency key, and walked to the front door. The new lock set was silver and clean. My brass key did not fit it, but I had not expected it to. I used the service key on the side door, which Petra's emergency lock company had not replaced, because it was not visible from the front, and she had not thought to mention it. The door opened. I held it. My mother walked through first. She paused in the threshold and looked once at Petra, the way June Caldwell looked at things she had taken a full measure of and would not be discussing further. Then she went inside. My father carried both suitcases through the door. He set them down in the hallway and straightened up and looked around at the cottage he had never been inside, and his face did something I kept for myself. Lorna came up the steps. She touched my arm once as she passed and went inside. I stood in the doorway and looked at Petra and Conrad on the porch. Petra's arms had dropped to her sides. Conrad was still looking at the lake. I did not tell them to leave. I did not need to. I held the door open until everyone who belonged inside was inside, and then I closed it. The door closed with the particular sound of a well-fitted door in a well-built frame, a sound I had noticed on the first day I visited the property and that I had thought about several times since. Outside, on the drive, I heard Petra's voice for the next several minutes. It came through the window in the kitchen, which I had cracked slightly because the morning was cool, and the inside of the cottage needed air after being closed up. Her voice had the quality of someone working through a position they no longer fully believed, finding the parts that still held and pressing on them out of habit, the way you press on a door after you have already been told it is locked. Conrad's voice was not in it. At some point the sound of the car doors came, then the engine, then the sound of the gravel under the tires as they pulled out of the drive, and then quiet. Lorna appeared in the kitchen doorway with her tea. She looked at me. "He's going to need time," she said, meaning Conrad. I said I knew. She nodded. She went back to her chair. Outside, the lake was the same as it had been. The Winterberry was the same. The light was the same, coming in from the northwest, doing what October light did in the late morning. The stone path ran from the porch to the water in a clean, straight line. I stood in the kitchen for a while. Then I put the kettle on. I stood in the kitchen of the cottage and looked out the window at the water. The kitchen was the way I had left it, with the 2 chairs at the table and the window above the sink that caught the afternoon light, and the view of the lake from almost every angle in the room. My mother was in the back bedroom, opening the suitcase. I heard the specific sound she makes when she is unpacking in an unfamiliar place, the methodical quality of it, the way June Caldwell approached any new space with the same patience she had brought to every cafeteria line for 22 years. Lorna was in the small sitting room with a cup of tea she had made from the supplies I had stocked the previous weekend. She did not say anything. She was the kind of company that did not require conversation to be useful. My father was on the porch that faced the lake, the one that ran the full width of the front face, the one I had designed and re-leveled and thought about every time I thought about this moment. He had his hands on the railing. He was looking at the water. The light was doing what I had known it would do at this hour, coming in from the northwest, making everything gold along the shore. I let him look. Gideon sent a letter the following morning. It went to Conrad's email with Petra copied. It confirmed the title status of the property. It noted that an unauthorized lock change had been made by a third party who had no legal interest in the property, and it described this as an actionable interference with the owner's rights. He named the specific statutes. He did not threaten. He documented. That was what Gideon did. And he did it with the efficiency of a person who had spent 30 years building documents that could not be argued with. He also noted, in the final paragraph, that the lock service invoice bore the name and payment card of a party who had represented themselves as authorized to request lock services on the property, which was inaccurate. He said this might be relevant to any future discussions about the matter. He said it in the precise language of someone who wanted the reader to understand exactly how much trouble they were one phone call away from. Petra did not respond to the letter. She did not call me. She has not called me. Conrad called 2 days later. He called at 8 in the morning, which was earlier than Conrad usually called anyone, and which told me that he had been waiting to make the call and had finally decided to do it before he thought about it longer. He said he had not known she was going to change the locks. He said he had told her the cottage was a family gift, and that he supposed she had taken that further than he intended. He said he was sorry things had happened the way they did. I told him the part he said about not knowing rang about 60% true, which was being generous. He did not answer that immediately. I could hear him on the other end of the line, which is a specific kind of sound, a person sitting with a thing they cannot argue out of without making it worse. "You knew something was going on," I said. "You didn't ask what?" He said he had known she was thinking about the cottage differently than I was. He said he had not asked because he had not wanted to know the specifics, which he understood. Saying it out loud was not a defense. He said he should have asked. He said it the way people say things when they have finally arrived at an understanding that has been sitting in the room waiting for them. The words were true. He just needed more time with them before they would be fully his. I told him I would call when I was ready. I did not tell him when that would be, because I did not yet know. Conrad was my brother, and that was a fact that was going to outlast the difficulty, but the difficulty was present, and I was going to be honest about it for as long as it was. He said he understood. I said goodbye and hung up and went back to my desk. Mr. Howell sent me a note in the mail, the kind written on actual paper. He said he was glad the matter had been sorted out and that he would continue to keep an eye on the property in winter as he always had. He included, without comment, a copy of the entry he had written in his own records on Thursday afternoon, noting the arrival of the service truck and the time it spent on the property. It was the kind of note a surveyor writes. It was clear, dated, and signed. I put it in the folder. Petra had booked the cottage for herself and 2 friends for the following month through a rental platform, using the property address. She had listed it as available without my knowledge or authorization. Gideon's letter prompted the platform to pull the listing within 48 hours of receiving his documentation, along with a note from the platform's legal team that the listing had been submitted by a party who could not demonstrate ownership, which was a category the platform took seriously because they had been through that before. I was told about the booking removal by the property manager, who had been alerted by the platform and who called me with the efficiency of someone who had managed enough lake properties to understand that owner disputes were a category requiring prompt attention. He said he had not known the listing existed. I told him I had not known either. He said he was sorry for the trouble and asked if I needed anything else handled. I said no, and thanked him. I was not interested in pursuing the matter beyond what Gideon had documented. The locksmith invoice was on file. The title was clean. The letter had been sent and received. What Petra had attempted had cost her the ground she thought she was standing on, which was the ground she had never owned in the first place. And that was consequence enough for this moment. Lorna called my mother every day for a week after the anniversary weekend, the way she had always called during things that mattered. She did not dramatize what had happened on the porch. She described it to the family members who asked in plain terms what time Walter and June had arrived, what they had found, how long they had waited, and what had happened when I pulled into the drive. She let the facts arrange themselves. They arranged themselves clearly. The family drew the conclusions the facts supported. That was the structure Gideon had built. It was the structure I had asked him for. Clean documentation, he had said. Always better for a gift property. I had not known at the time what it was going to need to protect. I had simply believed him, the way you believe a person who is good at their work. My parents stayed through Sunday. On Saturday morning, I woke before 6 and lay in the spare bedroom for a while without moving. The cottage was quiet in the way that properties near water are quiet, the lake noise underneath everything, a constant low presence. I made coffee and brought 2 cups to the porch. My father was already there. He was standing at the railing with both hands wrapped around his mug, looking at the lake. He was wearing the cardigan he wore on cold mornings, the gray one with the fraying cuffs that my mother had mended twice and said she was going to mend a 3rd time. He had his coffee the way he had it every morning, which I already knew because I had bought the same brand he kept at home and put it in the kitchen before they arrived. I stood beside him and did not say anything. The water was flat and pale in the early light. A thin mist sat on the surface close to the far shore. The winterberry along the western fence had come in exactly as red as I had wanted it to, which was the thing about winterberry in October, that you could count on it. The stone path ran from the porch steps down to the water in a clean and level line. My father drank his coffee. After a while, he said that this was a good place. I said I thought so too. He nodded once. He looked out at the water. He did not ask how much it cost or what the taxes were or what would happen to it eventually. He was not that kind of man. He took things the way they were given, which was a quality I had loved in him my whole life and had only recently understood how rare it was. We stood there until the mist burned off the far shore. The light came in from the northwest the way I had known it would, the way I had stood in that exact spot in August and tracked it across the property, thinking about this exact morning. My mother appeared in the doorway at 6:30. She had her own cup and her cardigan and the brass key, which she had been carrying in her pocket since Friday evening. She sat down in the porch chair nearest the railing and pulled her cardigan around her and said nothing. The 3 of us were on the porch as the light changed, And somewhere on the far side of the lake, a bird crossed low over the water and disappeared into the trees. And my father watched it go with the unhurried attention of a man who finally had time to watch things. Before I left on Sunday afternoon, I had the locksmith my property manager recommended install a new set of locks on both exterior doors. The emergency lockbox code was changed to a number I gave to my parents and Lorna and no one else. I had 2 sets of keys made. I put the first set in my father's hand at the front door. He turned them over and looked at them the way he looked at things that had landed in a way he had not prepared for, and could not quite find the right shape of words for yet. His hands were large and rough at the knuckles from 31 years of pipework, and the keys were small in them, and he closed his fingers around them carefully, the way he closed his fingers around things he intended to keep. The second set I gave to my mother. She already had the brass key, the engraved one, the one with W and J on the back. It had not fit the lock Petra installed. But I had asked the locksmith to cut the new hardware to match the original key, so now it did. June Caldwell held the key in her palm and looked at the engraving for a moment. Then she looked at me. Then she looked back at the key. She closed her fingers around it. She did not say anything. There was not anything to say that the closed hand did not already say better. The cottage stands at the end of a gravel road that curves around the western edge of the lake. It has a porch that faces the water and a kitchen with a window that catches the afternoon light, and a stone path from the door to the shore that runs clean and level. The winterberry is red in October, and the light comes in from the northwest in the late afternoon and turns the whole property gold. My parents' names are not on the deed. They never needed to be. Their names are on something more specific, a lifetime use agreement, drafted by an attorney, filed in 2 offices, notarized and protected. What it says, in the language Gideon used, is that Walter and June Caldwell have the right to be there for the rest of their lives, and no one can take that right without going through the owner of the property. I am the owner of the property. I did not put anyone else's name on it. Not because I was planning for this, because Gideon said clean documentation was better, and I had believed him, and it turned out he was right in a way neither of us anticipated. The brass key hangs on a hook inside the front door of the cottage now. My mother put it there herself, the first time she came back after the anniversary weekend. She said she wanted it where she could see it when she walked in, and where she could touch it when she walked out. And that was where it went. It is small and worn at the head from being carried in a pocket for 3 hours on a porch in October. The engraving on the back is still clear. W and J 40 years. My father has been to the cottage 4 times since the anniversary. He goes on Tuesday mornings when the weather is right and comes back Thursday evenings. He brings the cracked handle coffee mug from home because it holds heat correctly and fits his hand. He sits on the porch with his coffee in the morning and watches the lake, and on the days when the light comes in from the northwest in the afternoon and turns everything gold along the shore, he watches that too. He has not said much about any of it. He does not need to. If you have ever built something for the people who raised you and watched someone try to stand between them and the door, comment key below. Someone reading this is standing in a hallway right now, carrying something similar, and they need to know the door still opens. Subscribe for more stories about quiet people who held the door open for the ones who deserve to walk through first.